At her son's birthday party, Margaret noticed her seat card read, "The woman invited out of pity." She had been looking forward to that day for weeks, imagining hugging her son Thomas, seeing her grandchildren, and feeling part of the family again. Instead, those 6 cruel words changed everything. Margaret clutched the card with trembling hands, feeling the room spin around her as other guests began to enter the elegant restaurant. She had raised Thomas alone after her husband's death, working 2 jobs to pay for his college education, sacrificing her own dreams so he could have every opportunity. And now, at 58, she discovered that her presence in her son's life was seen as an act of charity. But Margaret didn't know that this humiliating moment was just the beginning of a much more painful discovery. Something was happening behind the scenes of her family, something that explained not only that cruel card, but years of strange behavior and gradual estrangement. Follow this story to the end and comment on where you're watching from so we can see how far this story has come. Margaret Bennett always believed that a mother's love was unconditional and eternal. She had built her entire life around this belief, especially after her husband David died in a car accident when Thomas was only 8 years old. For 20 years, she was both mother and father, working as a secretary during the day and cleaning offices at night. Every extra penny went towards Thomas's education, his violin lessons, and the summer camp he so desperately wanted. She wore the same clothes for years, drove an old car that constantly broke down, and lived in a small apartment when she could have pursued something better for herself, all so that Thomas could have opportunities she never had. And Thomas prospered. He graduated from a prestigious university, became a successful corporate lawyer, and married Victoria, a woman from a wealthy family whom Margaret never really got to know. They had 2 beautiful children, 7-year-old Emma and 5-year-old James. On the surface, it seemed that all of Margaret's sacrifices had been worthwhile. But in the last 3 years, since Thomas and Victoria moved into the mansion in Riverside Estates, something has changed. Visits have become rarer and shorter. Phone calls, once weekly, have become monthly and then almost non-existent. When Margaret called, Victoria usually answered, saying that Thomas was busy in an important meeting or traveling for work. The children, who used to spend weekends with their grandmother, now rarely see her. Margaret tried not to take it personally. Thomas was building his career, after all. Victoria came from a different world with different expectations. The children had their own activities, music lessons, sports, social engagements. But deep down, in the quiet place in her heart where she kept her deepest worries, Margaret felt she was losing her son. Then came the invitation to Thomas's birthday party, his 35th. It was delivered by mail, not delivered personally or even mentioned in a phone call. A formal invitation printed on expensive paper, the kind you send to work colleagues and casual acquaintances. Margaret held the thick envelope, noticing that her name was written in elegant handwriting that certainly wasn't Thomas's. Victoria, probably, or perhaps someone hired to make things pretty. Formal dinner at Les Jardins, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Dress code, elegant. RSVP by June 15th. Margaret looked at the clothes hanging in her small closet, none of them appropriate for a place like Les Jardins. She would have to buy something new, which would mean using some of her carefully saved money. But it would be worth it, she convinced herself. It would be a chance to reconnect with Thomas, to get to know Victoria better, to spend time with her precious grandchildren. She spent almost $200 on a dark blue dress that the saleswoman said was appropriate for formal dinners, and another $50 on matching shoes. She went to the salon for the first time in months to get her graying brown hair done. When she looked in the mirror on the night of the party, she saw a woman who was trying very hard, trying to belong to a world that wasn't hers. Margaret arrived at Les Jardins 15 minutes early, her palms sweating as she handed the keys to her old car to the valet, who barely concealed his disdainful expression. The restaurant was everything she had imagined. Crystal chandeliers, tables draped in white linen tablecloths, waiters in impeccable uniforms gliding silently among the guests. A young, pretty woman at the entrance checked names against a list. "Name, please?" she asked with a professional smile. "Margaret Bennett," she replied, her voice softer than intended. "Ah, yes, Mr. Bennett's mother." The woman who was invited out of pity? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She blinked, certain she had misread, but the words remained, unchanging and cruel. Her heart began to pound in her chest. Her hands trembled so much that she almost dropped the card. "Madam?" The waiter was waiting, his expression politely inquisitive. "Is there a problem?" Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What would she say? That someone, possibly her own daughter-in-law, possibly her own son, saw her as an object of pity? That her presence at Thomas's birthday celebration was tolerated, not desired? "No," she finally managed to say. "There's no problem." She followed the waiter across the room, aware of every curious glance, every whisper. Her seat was at a corner table, not at the main table where Thomas and Victoria were seated with Victoria's family and the most important partners from Thomas's law firm. Margaret's table included a few distant colleagues from the firm and their spouses, people who clearly didn't know who she was. She sat down, placing the offensive seat card face down, and tried to control her breathing. Her eyes searched for Thomas across the hall. He was laughing at something Victoria's father had said, his hand resting casually on the back of his wife's chair. Victoria looked stunning in a red dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. The children, Emma and James, sat obediently beside them, dressed like little adults in their formal attire. Thomas hadn't glanced in her direction even once. During the cocktail party, Margaret remained at her table while others mingled and chatted. She tried to make polite conversation with those around her, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. All she could think about was the seat card, those awful words. Who had done that? And more importantly, was it true? Was she really only there because Thomas felt obligated to invite her? Then something happened that made her blood run cold. Margaret got up to go to the bathroom, needing a moment away from the curious glances and the suffocating embarrassment. As she passed through a small anteroom near the bathrooms, she heard voices, two women talking in low tones, but not low enough. "Did you see his mother's seat card?" one voice asked, tinged with cruel amusement. Margaret recognized the voice. It was Victoria. She froze in the hallway, her body pressed against the wall, invisible to the women in the next room. "That was a brilliant touch, Victoria," another voice replied, probably one of Victoria's sophisticated friends. "Did Thomas agree to it?" "Thomas doesn't know anything about it," Victoria chuckled lightly. "He would have been upset if he knew. He still has this ridiculous sense of obligation towards her. But frankly, darling, the woman is embarrassing. Did you see her dress? Probably from the Macy's sale." Margaret's blood ran cold in her veins. She should leave, not listen to anything more, but her feet seemed cemented in place. "But she's his mother," her friend said, though her tone suggested she was playing devil's advocate rather than truly defending Margaret. "Exactly," Victoria said with disdain in her voice, "and she never lets anyone forget. Every conversation is about the sacrifices she made, how hard she worked, how she paid for everything. It's exhausting. Thomas feels he owes her everything, and she uses that guilt to cling to him. So what are you going to do?" "I'm already doing it," Victoria said, and Margaret could hear the satisfied smile in her voice. Distance. Boundaries. Make sure the children are always too busy to visit. Thomas is so focused on making a partner at the firm that he barely notices. In a few years, she'll just be an inconvenient memory, someone we see at Christmas if we're lucky. Margaret didn't wait to hear any more. She staggered back down the hall, her legs almost giving way beneath her. She pushed open the bathroom door and locked herself in a stall where she finally let the tears come, biting her hand to silence the sobs that threatened to escape. Her whole body trembled. The pain in her chest was physical, as if someone had plunged a knife between her ribs and twisted them. She had given everything for Thomas, everything, and Victoria, the woman he had chosen to love, saw it as manipulation, as a burden. Worse, she was actively driving Thomas away from his mother, poisoning his grandchildren against her. And Margaret, in her naivete, hadn't realized it. She had thought the distance was natural, just part of Thomas growing up and building his own family. But it wasn't natural. It was intentional. It was cruel. Margaret left the stall and looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged. She looked old, tired, defeated. She washed her face, tried to fix her makeup, and took several deep breaths. She had to decide: leave now, cause a scene that Victoria would love, or stay, maintain her dignity, and find out exactly how far this betrayal would go. Margaret returned to her table, her face a carefully composed mask concealing the inner storm. She watched Victoria return to the room moments later, impeccably dressed and smiling, gliding back to her seat beside Thomas as if she hadn't just finished discussing how to erase her mother-in-law from their lives. Dinner was served, course after course of expensive food that Margaret could barely taste. Each bite was ashes in her mouth. She smiled politely, nodded at the empty comments of those around her, and observed. She watched as Victoria touched Thomas's arm possessively. She watched as the children, her precious grandchildren, barely glanced in her direction all night. She watched as Thomas, her son, the baby she cradled in her arms when David died, didn't come to her table once to check on her. When it came time for the toasts, Victoria's father stood up first, his speech full of inside jokes about golf and business that Margaret didn't understand. Victoria toasted next, her voice soft as she spoke about how Thomas was a wonderful husband, a devoted father, a provider. No mention of the woman who truly raised him. Margaret waited, her heart shrinking, hoping Thomas would acknowledge her, that he would say something about her. He didn't. His toast was about gratitude to his mentors, to Victoria for believing in him, to his in-laws for their wisdom and support. Margaret could also be invisible. When dinner ended and the guests began to mingle again, Margaret finally stood up. She had made her decision. She would go to Thomas, try one last time to reach him, to talk to him about what she had heard. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was an explanation. Perhaps Victoria was acting alone. Perhaps Thomas didn't know. She navigated through the crowd, her Macy's sale dress suddenly looking tighter, cheaper. Thomas was near the bar, laughing with a colleague. "Thomas," she called softly, touching his arm. He turned, and for a brief moment she saw surprise on his face, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Mom," he said, and there was something in his tone, not exactly warm, but not hostile either. Obligation, she realized. He was fulfilling an obligation. "Happy birthday, dear," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts. "I wanted to give you this." She held out an envelope, a gift that had taken her weeks to gather, $500, half of her savings, because she wanted him to have something special. Thomas took the envelope with one hand, barely glancing at it. "Thank you, Mom. You didn't have to." But there was no gratitude in his voice, just casual embarrassment. "I wanted to," Margaret said. "Thomas, I was thinking, maybe I could take Emma and James to the park next week. It's been so long since we've spent time together." Something crossed Thomas's face, discomfort perhaps, or guilt. Before he could answer, Victoria appeared beside them, her arm sliding through Thomas's with familiar propriety. "Margaret," she said, and her smile was all superficial cordiality. "Very kind of you to come. I know it's a long trip from your apartment." It was a subtle reminder, her class separation, her place outside their inner circle. Margaret met Victoria's eyes and for a moment allowed the other woman to see that she knew, she had heard. Victoria blinked first, her mask slipping just a fraction before recovering. "About the park," Victoria said, turning to Thomas but clearly aiming her words at Margaret. "The children have tennis tomorrow, ballet Tuesday, Mandarin Wednesday, and the weekends are reserved for family vacations. We're going to the Hamptons next week." "I understand," Margaret said softly. She looked at Thomas, hoping he would say something, defend her, tell Victoria that her mother was important too. He said nothing. He just stood there, his silence louder than any word. She had spent 20 years being soft, being compliant, being what everyone needed her to be. Maybe it was time to be something else. "Actually," Margaret heard herself say, her voice firmer than she expected, "I needed to talk to you about something, Thomas. In private, if possible." Victoria tensed, but Thomas only nodded, looking relieved to have an excuse to escape the awkward moment. "Sure, Mom, let's go over there." They moved to a quieter area of the restaurant, away from the music and laughter. Thomas put his hands in his pockets, his body language defensive even before she began to speak. "What is it, Mom? I really should go back to the guests." Margaret took a deep breath. It was now or never. "I heard Victoria earlier," she said, "talking to a friend about me, about how she's deliberately keeping me away from you and the children." Thomas's face flushed red, then pale. He didn't deny it immediately, which told Margaret everything she needed to know. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew Victoria was pushing his mother out, and he'd let it happen. "Mom," he began, and she could hear the defensiveness growing in his voice. "Victoria only wants what's best for our family, and honestly, you can be a little, well, suffocating sometimes." The word hit Margaret like a slap. "Suffocating?" "Yes," Thomas said, and now the floodgates were open. Everything he'd seemingly been holding back for years began to pour out. "You always make me feel guilty. Every conversation is about how much you sacrificed, how much you gave up. I never asked for any of those sacrifices, Mom. I was 8 when Dad died. You made choices, and now you act like I owe you my whole life because of them." Margaret felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. I never wanted you to feel guilty, Thomas. I just wanted you to know that you were loved, that I would do anything for you." "Well, it's suffocating," Thomas repeated, his voice harder now. "Victoria helped me see that. She helped me set boundaries. And honestly, Mom, it's been better for me. Less guilt, less obligation." "I'm your mother," Margaret whispered. "I'm not an obligation. I thought I was your family." "You are my family," Thomas said, but there was distance in his voice. "But Victoria and the children are my family too. And I have to prioritize them." Margaret looked at the son she had raised, searching for any trace of the sweet boy who used to crawl onto her bed during storms, who hugged her tightly and said he loved her. That boy had disappeared, replaced by this stranger who spoke of her as if she were a burden to be managed. "The seat card," she said softly. "The woman invited out of pity. Did you know about that?" Thomas looked away, guilt finally crossing his face. "No, that was Victoria's idea. If I had known, I would have said something." "Would you have?" Margaret asked. "Or would you have let it happen like you let everything else Victoria does? When did you become so weak, Thomas? When did you stop thinking for yourself?" Anger flashed in Thomas's eyes. "I'm not weak. I just finally understood that it's time to live my own life, without guilt, without being constantly reminded of everything you went through." "I never," Margaret began, but then stopped. Had she done that? Had she used his sacrifices as a weapon, even unintentionally? Had she made Thomas feel he owed his happiness to her? Perhaps she had. Perhaps in her grief and loneliness after David's death, she had clung to Thomas too much, invested everything of herself in him, made him responsible for validating all those difficult years. "I'm sorry," she finally said, and she meant it. "If I made you feel this way, I'm sorry. But Thomas, I'm your mother. I love you. And Victoria is poisoning you against me. She said it herself, that in a few years I would just be an inconvenient memory." Thomas shook his head. "You don't understand Victoria. She comes from a different world. She has different standards." "Standards that don't include respecting your mother-in-law," Margaret said bitterly. "Standards that involve isolating you from your only family." "I have family," Thomas said defensively. "Victoria's parents, her siblings, they accepted me." They accepted her connections, Margaret thought, but didn't say. They accepted her intelligence and ambition, her potential to elevate their status. But to her, the woman who truly raised him, they saw her as an embarrassment to be hidden. "I think," Margaret said slowly, her voice trembling but determined, "that I need some time away. From you, from Victoria, from all of this." Thomas looked shocked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not going to beg for your time or attention anymore. I'm not going to invite myself into my grandchildren's lives anymore. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt when you forget my birthday, or when months go by without a call." "You want boundaries, Thomas? Here's a boundary. The door is open, but you're going to have to be the one to walk through it." She turned to leave, but Thomas grabbed her arm. "Mom, wait, you're overreacting." "Am I?" Margaret looked at his arm around hers, then at his face. "When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you brought the kids over without me having to ask? When was the last time you treated me like someone you really wanted in your life instead of someone you had to tolerate?" Thomas dropped his hand, unresponsive. "Exactly," Margaret said softly. "Happy birthday, Thomas. I hope it's worth it, everything you're giving up for this new family of yours." She walked through the restaurant, her head held high despite the tears burning behind her eyes. She didn't look back. She didn't seek one last glimpse of her son or grandchildren. She simply left, into the cool night, took her car from the valet, and drove home through streets blurred by unshed tears. It was only when she was safe in her small apartment, the door locked behind her, that Margaret finally allowed the full extent of the pain to wash over her. She collapsed to the living room floor, her sobs echoing off the empty walls, her body shaking with the force of her grief. She had lost everything. Her husband to a tragic accident, and now her son to something equally cruel: ambition, shame, the poisonous influence of a woman who saw love as weakness and loyalty as obligation. But as she lay there, broken and bleeding in ways no doctor could cure, something else began to grow amidst the pain. Anger. Not hot, impulsive anger, but something colder, more determined. She had given 20 years to the son who had discarded her like trash. Perhaps it was time to stop giving, to stop sacrificing, to stop making her life small so that his could be big. Perhaps it was time for Margaret Bennett to finally begin living for herself. The days following Thomas's birthday unfolded in a whirlwind of emotions for Margaret. She called in sick to work, something she never did, and spent 2 days in her apartment simply existing. She didn't call Thomas. He didn't call her. The silence was deafening, but also, she discovered, liberating. Without the constant pressure of trying to maintain a connection that clearly only she wanted, Margaret began to have space to breathe, to think, to feel things beyond obligation and guilt. On the third morning, she woke with a strange clarity. She got up, made coffee, and sat down at her small kitchen table with a notebook. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "Things I want to do for myself." It was a strange exercise. How long had it been since she'd thought in terms of wanting rather than needing or having to? But slowly, hesitantly, the words began to come. Travel, she wrote. She had always wanted to see the Grand Canyon, hike through redwood forests, lie on the beach and watch the sunset over the ocean. Go back to school, maybe take that art course that had always interested her. Make friends, real connections with people who valued her. Find joy. The words surprised her, but once they were on paper, she realized how true they were. She had forgotten what joy was, that kind of happiness that comes from within rather than being reflected back through her son's achievements. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret's heart leaped, hope blossoming before she could stop it. Thomas? But when she opened the door, it was a delivery man holding a large bouquet of flowers. Margaret Bennett? Yes? Delivery for you. She took the flowers, confused, and carried them inside. The card was signed Thomas and Victoria. The message was brief and formal. Thank you for coming to the party. It was good to see you. No apology, no acknowledgement of the hurt or the conversation they had had, just polite formality, the kind of message you send to a distant acquaintance. Margaret looked at the flowers, their sweet scent suddenly nauseating. She walked to the kitchen, opened the trash can, and threw the whole arrangement away. If they thought that store-bought flowers would fix years of neglect and one night of public humiliation, they were mistaken. She wasn't that cheap. That afternoon, Margaret did something she had never done before. She researched support groups for alienated parents and found one that met Thursday evenings at a community center 3 miles away. She almost didn't go. The idea of sitting in a circle of strangers and admitting that her own son no longer wanted her was nearly unbearable. But something pushed her out the door, into the car, through the evening traffic. The community center smelled of stale coffee and pine. The meeting room was on the second floor, and Margaret stood outside the door for long minutes, her hand on the doorknob, gathering courage. Finally, she pushed inside. There were perhaps 12 people sitting in a circle of folding plastic chairs. They ranged in age from a woman in her 40s to a man who looked to be 80. They all had one thing in common, a kind of quiet sadness in their eyes that Margaret recognized because she saw it in her own reflection every day. "You must be Margaret," a woman in her 50s said, standing up to greet her. "I'm Sarah. I facilitate this group. Welcome." The next 2 hours were some of the most difficult and also the most healing of Margaret's life. As she listened to others share their stories, sons and daughters who had stopped speaking to them for reasons ranging from ideological disagreements to, like Margaret, the influence of manipulative spouses, she realized she wasn't alone. Her pain wasn't unique. She hadn't failed in some fundamental way as a mother, though part of her still whispered that she had. When it was her turn to share, the words flowed out, the whole birthday, the seat card, the conversation she'd overheard, the confrontation with Thomas. When she finished, there were tears on several faces around the circle. "You did the right thing," Sarah said gently. "Setting that boundary. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but you did." "It seems like I gave up on him," Margaret whispered. "You didn't give up," a man on the other side of the circle said. His name was Robert, and he had lost contact with his daughter 5 years earlier. "You just stopped making yourself small to make him feel better about treating you badly. That's the thing about boundaries. They protect us, but they also force other people to confront their own behavior." Margaret left that first meeting feeling strangely lighter. Not healed, the wound was still too raw for that, but less alone. She exchanged numbers with Sarah and a few other women in the group. For the first time in years, she had people to talk to who truly understood. The weeks turned into months. Margaret continued going to the Thursday meetings. She signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center. She started walking every morning in a nearby park where she befriended other regular walkers. Slowly, painfully, she began to build a life that didn't revolve entirely around a son who didn't want her. Thomas didn't call, neither did Victoria. Emma and James' birthdays passed without invitations. Thanksgiving came and went, and Margaret spent it with Sarah and her husband, who welcomed her into their home with genuine kindness. It was different. It wasn't the family she had dreamed of, but it was good. It was real. Then, 3 days before Christmas, Margaret's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but it had the local area code. She answered hesitantly. "Hello? Mrs. Bennett? Margaret Bennett?" The voice was male, formal, unfamiliar. "Yes? Who is this?" "My name is David Chen. I'm a lawyer." "I'm calling on behalf of your late husband, David Bennett." Margaret's heart stopped. "My husband? But he died 20 years ago." "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware of that, but there are some matters relating to his estate that need to be settled. Could you come to my office tomorrow, say 2 o'clock? Margaret agreed, confused and a little frightened. What matters could possibly need to be settled after 2 decades? She barely slept that night, her mind swirling with possibilities. The next morning, she dressed carefully and drove to the address Mr. Chen had provided. It was a modest office in an older building downtown. Mr. Chen was an Asian American man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Bennett, thank you for coming," he said, indicating a chair in front of his desk. "I'm sure you're confused about why I asked you to come." "Very confused," Margaret admitted. Mr. Chen opened a thick folder on his desk. "I was your late husband, David's lawyer. When he died, there were certain provisions in his will and insurance policies that were executed, but there was also a trust account set up to be kept secret until specific circumstances were met." Margaret blinked. "A trust account? I don't know anything about that." "No, you wouldn't. David was very specific about it. The trust was to be revealed only under 2 conditions. First, when you turned 60, or second, if your son Thomas ever repudiated you or mistreated you in a way that made you unworthy of inheritance." Margaret's world tilted again, just as it had on the night of the party. I don't understand." Mr. Chen pushed some papers on the table toward her. "Your husband was a very wise man, Mrs. Bennett. He knew he was dying. The accident wasn't an accident. He had a heart attack at the wheel. The doctors had given him 6 months, maybe a year. He knew, and he prepared." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "I didn't know. He never said." "He didn't want you to know. He wanted the last few months to be normal. But he cared about you and Thomas. He set up life insurance policies that saw him through college and provided for you. But he also set up this trust, fueled by investments he had made years before. The trust has grown considerably over the last 2 decades. "How much?" Margaret asked, her voice just a whisper. "Currently, it's valued at about $1,200,000. The room spun. Margaret gripped the edges of her chair, trying to steady herself. "This can't be real." "It's very real," Mr. Chen assured her. "And there's more. David left a letter for you to be delivered along with the revelation of the trust. He made me promise I would deliver it personally." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellowed, obviously old envelope. The handwriting on the front was David's, his firm, familiar script making Margaret's heart ache with recognition. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the envelope and began to read. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then either you have turned 60 or our son has deeply disappointed you. I hope it's the former, but if it's the latter, I need you to know a few things. First, nothing Thomas did or didn't do reflects your worth as a mother. You are the strongest, most loving, most self-sacrificing woman I have ever known. You gave everything to our son, and if he can't see that, if he can't honor that, then the fault is his, not yours. Second, I knew my heart disease would eventually kill me. The doctors were clear. I could have told you, but I didn't want our last months together to be about death and grief. I wanted every precious moment left to be about love, so I did what I could to protect us, to protect you. This money is for you, Margaret, not for Thomas unless he proves to be the man I hope he is. For you, to travel, to dream, to live the life you deserve. Third, and this is the most important, don't let yourself be diminished by how anyone else treats you. You are extraordinary. You are worthy of love, respect, joy. If our son has forgotten this, remind him, not by begging for a place in your life, but by living so fully, so brilliantly, that he realizes what he is missing. And if he never realizes it, if he chooses pride or vanity or the influence of other people over you, then live anyway. Live for yourself. I love you, Margaret. I always have. And wherever I am now, I'm still rooting for you. Always yours, David. Margaret finished reading, tears streaming down her face. She pressed the letter against her chest, feeling as if David were there in the room with her, his arms around her as they used to be. There are specific instructions on how the trust can be used, Mr. Chen said gently, giving her a moment to compose herself. It's unrestricted for you, you can do whatever you want with it, but if you choose to leave it to Thomas, there are conditions. What conditions? Margaret asked, wiping her eyes. He must demonstrate, through consistent actions over a minimum period of 2 years, that he has restored a respectful and loving relationship with you. I, as executor of the trust, would be responsible for determining whether that condition has been met. Margaret looked at the lawyer, then back at David's letter, then at the financial documents spread across the table showing 20 years of careful growth. Her husband, knowing he was dying, had found a way to care for her even from the grave. He had seen, with the clarity that sometimes comes when facing one's own mortality, that she might need protection not only financial, but emotional. And he had provided both. I need time, Margaret said finally, to process all this. Of course, Mr. Chen said. Take all the time you need. The money isn't going anywhere. When you're ready to discuss how you'd like to proceed, just call me. Margaret left the office in a daze. She sat in her car for long minutes, just breathing, trying to make sense of this impossible turn of events. She wasn't poor. She would never have to worry about money again. She could do all those things on her list: travel, go back to school, live. But more than the money, it was David's letter, his love for her, his desire to protect her, his belief in her. It was everything she needed to hear, and she didn't know how much until she had those words in her hands. That night, Margaret sat in her small apartment reading David's letter over and over until she knew it by heart. She thought about Thomas, about how to tell him about the trust, or if she should tell him at all. The old Margaret, the one who existed before the birthday, would have rushed to share the news, would have seen it as a bridge back to her son, a way to prove that she wasn't the burden Victoria painted her as. But this Margaret, the one rising from the ashes of her old life, knew better. Telling Thomas about the money now, in this state of their relationship, would only be inviting him back for the wrong reasons. No, if Thomas came back, it would have to be because he realized he wanted his mother in his life, not for money, not out of obligation, but out of love. And if he never realized it, then she would live as David had instructed, fully, brilliantly, for herself. The next morning, Margaret called Sarah. Do you have any plans for Christmas? Just a quiet get-together at home, Sarah replied. Why? I was thinking of doing something a little unconventional, Margaret said, and wondering if you and some of the others in the group would like to join me. What do you have in mind? Margaret smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Excitement, possibility, joy. How do you feel about spending Christmas at the Grand Canyon? Christmas at the Grand Canyon was magical. Margaret rented a van and took Sarah and 3 other women from the support group, all of whom found themselves alone during the holidays because of fractured relationships with adult children. They drove through the desert, stopping in small towns along the way, laughing and talking in a way Margaret had never experienced with friends before, because she had never really had friends, she realized. Her entire adult life had been about work and Thomas. On Christmas morning, they stood on the edge of the canyon watching the sun rise over that vast, ancient wound in the earth. Margaret thought about how sometimes things had to break, be carved and eroded before they could become beautiful. Perhaps she was like the canyon, scarred by loss and pain, but somehow made more magnificent because of it.
"Thank you," Sarah said softly beside her, "for this. For reminding us that we can still have joy." "Thank you," Margaret replied, "for helping me find it." They returned home 2 days later, tanned and happy. Margaret had photos on her phone of the canyon, of the women laughing together, of herself truly smiling for the first time in months. She posted them on her virtually inactive social media page, not for Thomas to see, she wasn't even sure if he still followed her, but because she wanted to, because they were beautiful and real, and they were hers. The week after New Year's, Margaret gave her notice at work. Her boss was shocked. She'd been there for 15 years, but Margaret stood firm. She was enrolling in community college full-time, studying art. It was something she'd always wanted to do, but never had the time or money. Now she had both. She found a new apartment, too. Nothing extravagant, but bigger and brighter, with real light streaming in through the windows and space for an art studio. She hired an interior designer to help her make it feel like a home, not just a place where she was waiting for real life to begin. Real life had begun. January turned into February, February into March. Margaret heard nothing from Thomas. She didn't call him. The silence was becoming normal now, though it still hurt. It probably always would. You don't stop loving your child just because he stops acting like he loves you back. But the pain was different now, no longer consuming everything, no longer the only thing that defined her existence. In March, Margaret took another trip, this time to Seattle, to visit an old school friend she hadn't seen in 30 years. They reconnected through social media, and when Margaret mentioned she was thinking about traveling more, her friend insisted she come stay. It was a wonderful week exploring the city, eating amazing food, staying up late talking the way only old friends can. When Margaret returned home, there was a car parked in the driveway of her new apartment. An expensive car, one she recognized. Margaret's heart began to pound. She considered simply leaving, driving around town until they gave up and drove away. But no, she wasn't that person anymore. She didn't run away. She parked and got out of the car, her suitcase in hand. Thomas was standing beside his car, alone, no Victoria in sight. He looked terrible, tired and older than he should at 35. "Hi, Mom," he said, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Thomas?" Margaret replied, her voice neutral. "How did you know where I live?" I called your former landlord. He gave me the referral. I hope everything is all right." Margaret didn't answer, just waited. "You look fine," Thomas said, and there was surprise in his voice, as if he expected to find her broken, withered by his loss. "I'm fine," Margaret said simply. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you. Could I come in?" Margaret considered. Every fiber of her former self wanted to say yes, let him in, make coffee, pretend the last few months hadn't happened, but she wasn't that person anymore. "Why?" she asked. Thomas blinked. "What do you mean, why?" "I mean, why do you want to talk? You made it pretty clear at your birthday party how you feel about me. What changed?" Thomas looked away, discomfort written on every line of his face. "I saw your pictures," he said finally, "from the Grand Canyon. You looked happy, happier than I've seen you in years." "I was happy," Margaret said. "I am happy. I also saw that you're in college, studying art?" "Yes." "And you moved, got a new place?" "Yes." Thomas finally met her eyes.
How are you paying for all this? Your job didn't pay that much, and you were always saying how tight things were." Ah, there it was. No concern for her, no genuine desire to reconnect, curiosity about money. Margaret felt something inside her, the last thread of hope she was still holding on to, finally snap. "That's really none of your business, Thomas," she said calmly. "But, Mom," he began, and she could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Where had she gotten the money? An inheritance from someone he didn't know? An unexpected gain? And more importantly for Thomas, why hadn't she shared it with him? "No," Margaret interrupted him. "You wouldn't go that far. You wouldn't cut me out of your life, let your wife humiliate me, treat me like a burden, and then show up months later demanding explanations about my finances." "I'm not demanding anything," Thomas said defensively. I'm worried about you." "No, you're not," Margaret said, her voice sad but firm. "If you were worried about me, you would have called sometime in the last 4 months. You would have checked after your birthday to see if I was okay. You didn't do any of those things, Thomas, so don't pretend now that this is about concern." "You were the one who said you needed space," Thomas retorted. "You said I had to be the one to walk through the door. Well, here I am. I'm walking through the door." "You're walking through because you've seen my life improve without you in it," Margaret said, "and that bothers you. Or it bothers Victoria. Where is she, by the way?" Thomas blushed. "At home. She doesn't know I'm here." "Of course she doesn't," Margaret said, "because she's still controlling you, still dictating who you can see and when, and you're still letting her." "That's not fair," Thomas said. "Isn't that right? So tell me, Thomas, are you here because you realized you were wrong, because you miss your mother? Or are you here because you're curious about where the money came from and worried that you might be missing something?" Thomas's silence was his answer. Margaret nodded, not surprised but still hurt. "I thought so." "Mom, the situation is complicated." "No, it's not," Margaret said. "It's not complicated at all. You have a mother who loves you, who has always loved you, who sacrificed everything for you, and you have a wife who convinced you that this love is a burden. You chose your wife, which is your right, but you don't make me feel guilty for finally choosing myself." "So that's it?" Thomas asked, and now there was anger in his voice. "Are you cutting me off?" "No," Margaret said. "I'm just not making you the center of my world anymore. If you want a relationship with me, Thomas, you're welcome. But it has to be a real one. No obligatory calls at Christmas, not showing up when you need something. A real relationship where you treat me with respect, where you include me in your life because you want to, not because you feel you have to." "And what about my children?" Thomas demanded. "They're your grandchildren. Don't you want to see them?" The question was like a knife to Margaret's heart, but she kept her expression calm. "Of course I want to see them, but I'm not going to use them as hostages, and neither should you. If you want them to know me, to have a grandmother in their lives, then make it happen, but only if that's what you truly want, not as a bargaining chip." Thomas stood there for a long moment, clearly unsure what to make of this new version of his mother, the one who wasn't begging, wasn't giving in, wasn't making it easy for him to feel good about mistreating her. "I need to think," he finally said. "You do it," Margaret replied. She picked up her suitcase and started walking toward the building. "Mom," Thomas called when she reached the door. She turned. "I really miss you," he said, and for the first time it sounded like he could truly mean it. "Then do something about it," Margaret said gently, "but do it for the right reasons." She entered the building without looking back. Inside her apartment, Margaret put down her suitcase and went to the window. She watched Thomas stand beside his car for long minutes before finally getting in and driving away. She didn't know if he would return. She didn't know if they would ever have the relationship she had always hoped to have with her son. But she knew this: she would survive anyway, because she had discovered something precious in these last few months. She had discovered herself. Not Margaret Bennett, Thomas's mother, Not Margaret the widow, still grieving the husband she lost decades ago. Just Margaret, a woman with her own dreams and hopes, her own friends and interests, her own life worth living, whether Thomas was in it or not. That night, Margaret called Mr. Chen. "I've made a decision about trust," she said. "I want to use most of it for myself. Travel, education, doing all the things I've put off for so long. But I also want to establish a scholarship in my husband's name for first-generation students going to college. Students like Thomas was, from families who are sacrificing to give them opportunities." "That's wonderful," Mr. Chen said. "And what about the portion that was meant for Thomas?" Margaret thought about it. "Keep it under the original conditions," she finally said. "If he proves over 2 years that we can have a real and respectful relationship, then it's his. If not, well, then it goes to the scholarship too. Either way, it will do some good in the world." "Your husband would be very proud of you," Mr. Chen said softly. "I know he is," Margaret replied, and somehow she knew it was true. In the following months, Margaret's life blossomed in ways she had never imagined possible. Her art classes at community college challenged and inspired her. She discovered she had a real talent for watercolor painting, and her teacher encouraged her to consider selling her work. She traveled to the Pacific Northwest to see the redwood forests, to New England to see the autumn leaves, to the South to experience the hospitality and history. In each place, she took photos, made sketches, collected memories that were uniquely hers. She strengthened her friendships, particularly with Sarah, who became the sister Margaret never had. They went for walks together, went to museums, cooked elaborate dinners just because they could. Margaret even started dating casually, nothing serious, but it was nice to go out to dinner with men who found her interesting, who valued her company. And Thomas? She hadn't heard from him for 2 months after that day in front of her apartment. Then, one Thursday afternoon, her phone rang. It was Thomas. "Hi, Mom," he said when she answered. His voice was hesitant, almost shy. "Hello, Thomas. I was thinking, if you don't have any plans this Saturday, maybe we could have lunch, just the two of us? I'd like to talk, really talk." Margaret looked out the window of her art studio at the canvas she was working on, a landscape of the Grand Canyon bathed in golden sunset light. She thought about everything she had sacrificed, everything she had gained, the woman she was now versus the woman she used to be. "I'd like that," she finally said. "But Thomas, I need you to understand something. I love you, I always will, but I'm not going to make myself small anymore to fit into your life. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, it has to be one where we both consistently show each other that we care." "I understand," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice, humility perhaps, or just weariness. "And Mom, I'm truly sorry for everything." They were just words. Words were easy. Actions over time, those would be the real test. But it was a start. "Saturday," Margaret said, 1 o'clock. "That little cafe near the community college where I'm studying." "I'll be there," Thomas promised. When Margaret hung up, she returned to her painting. She didn't know if Thomas would keep his promise. She didn't know if they could ever fix what had been broken. But she knew this: whatever the outcome, she would be okay. Because Margaret Bennett had finally learned the most important lesson of all. She was worthy of love, respect, joy, not because of her role as someone's mother, but simply because she existed. And that was a lesson that no one, not even an ungrateful son and a cruel daughter-in-law, could take away from her. She added a touch of crimson gold to the sky in her painting, watching how it transformed the whole scene. Darkness becoming light, emptiness becoming beauty. Sometimes, she thought, the best works of art come from the most damaged canvases. Sometimes you have to be completely broken before you can become who you were truly meant to be all along. Margaret smiled, dipped her brush in fresh paint, and continued creating.